Welcome back to my introductory guide to the Revolution Eternal custom Magic format. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the first part of this guide at the info card on the top right of your screen. If you have, let's get right back into it. Previously, we talked about the 16 sets that make up the card pool for Revolution Eternal. Now that we have an understanding of what the basis of this format is, let's get into what strategies are possible thanks to these sets. As always, you can join the conversation in the Custom Magic Discord found in the description below to look up you can look up any of the cards in the format using the link to Revolution's custom card search engine, Manifesto. Additionally, there are two links below to the archived pages for the last two Eternal Grand Prix from April and November of 2023. They'll come up a bit during this conversation, and they're great resources if you're looking for inspiration for decks. Just keep in mind that those lists are dated, as key cards to some of those strategies have been changed since, and even just since last year's November Eternal Tournament, we have had 3 sets join the format. We've got 4 generalized categories here to go through, and we'll go through them in this order. We're going to start off with the more aggressive side of the pool with aggro and tempo decks, then pivot to talk about the most viable combos to keep an eye out for. After that, there are a few interesting mid-range and ramp angles to discuss, and we can route it out by going over the puzzle that is Eternal Control. Next time, we'll conclude this guide by going over some of the important sideboard cards you should keep an eye on when constructing your full 75. But for now, let's get into some archetypes. Starting off with perhaps the most iconic old-school aggro deck Revolution has, Experience is typically a lean, white-based aggro deck reliant on cheap creatures that carry the Experience mechanic, capable of scaling their stats turn by turn to eventually evolve into more powerful creatures once they cap out at 3 counters. Eager Hatchling is the best experienced creature to start out with, as it comes down on turn 1 and eventually becomes a 4/5 flyer, while Curious Cubs can be difficult to block even on the ground, and Wings of Trust eventually threatens to start padding your life total while leaving itself up to block. The deck aims to accelerate these creatures to their cap and flip Hatchling and Cubs especially fast by placing additional counters on those creatures with other effects. Notoriously, Morning Sun can get either of your DFC creatures to flip on their first attack for only 2 mana. The other cards are more questionable in terms of their viability for the strategy, but all offer some meaningful utility to the strategy while playing into the core game plan. Best of all, this is the first of countless decks that are well positioned to leverage a card I'll be bringing up a lot today. Heroes Never Die. For 2 mana at instant speed, Heroes Never Die can slip any non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less from the top 3 cards of your library or from your graveyard into play tapped. This means that any of the experienced creatures can be brought back with relative ease, and this can also be used to slip in a Spin Master, Overbearing Researcher, or Revolutionary class out onto the field. You can even do so during your opponent's turn to get tricky while threatening to hold up removal. Experience need not be a mono-white deck, however. Both red and green add some interesting pieces if you're looking to spice things up. Red brings with it more viable experience creatures, including the only other 1-mana creature with the mechanic, but the cards it provides otherwise don't really play into the plan all that well and would be better used by making room for burn spells. Green only brings a single easily splashed experience creature, but a far broader array of support cards for the strategy. It's worth noting that both of these colors also come with a double pip 2-drop with experience, and both are safe to call more powerful than many of the cards on this page, but the intensive casting costs of both make them a liability to splash. Finally, and perhaps the strangest direction to take experience, would be looking at splashing blue. Much like with red and green, there is an easily splashed 2-drop and a more restrictive 2-drop that carry the mechanic, but what's more appealing here is 2 things. First, there are a few fairly efficient pieces that can help you accelerate your white and blue experience creatures, mostly while protecting them from removal, burn, and or blockers. Second, with combo being such a looming threat in this environment, dipping into blue broadens the pool of potential on-the-stack interaction available significantly compared to what white is dependent on. While this does start to skew towards tempo play and away from standard aggro, this is by far the most valuable option into combo decks that are kicking around. One of the best build-arounds we have in the format is Brutality, a potent triple-pip green enchantment that makes every green creature spell you cast come with a 3/3 trampler, while also incidentally letting you hate on artifacts and enchantments with relative ease. The Brutality plan is one of the most aggressive decks I can see really succeeding in the format, getting to jam the best green creatures in the deck and the 4 aggressive plans to pile up big stats fast. Solid 1 and 2 mana creatures that scale can top out at Brutality, Skull and Nyxweaver, and Yen's Slope Skitter, while also getting away with a few non-creature spells in a Brutality deck. In my mind, there's no better backup candidate to Brutality in the non-creature slot than Nylea's Call. Almost every creature in your deck contributes as much devotion as they can, and a mid-sized call can still flip your budding companion before it attacks, meaning you get to untap your lands during main phase 1 and again when you attack. Even just with Companion in play, you can swing for 3 and flip it with Call on your second main to yield more mana to run out your hand, or you can just have it flip on attack potentially. Add on the fact that Skittertiller has Trample innately, Thorngrafter can opt into having Trample, and Nyxweaver can grant Trample counters to your creatures, and suddenly Nylea's Call threatens to push a lot of damage without asking you to really do anything you wouldn't already be doing. Moving on to one of the big boogeymen of the format, everyone has Diabolical Minion on the mind, thanks in part to its overwhelming success in the Pauper Eternal GP back in April of this year, locking 2/3 of the top cut of that tournament, and subsequently being banned in the Pauper Eternal format. There are frankly too many good cards to look at for a mono black minion deck because minion opens the door to all sorts of plans from breakneck aggro to grindier strategies, meaning we'll be coming back to minion a bit in the mid-range section. The pieces you see here are just some of the more lean parts of the puzzle. Darkright Cleric and Bloodfeast Baron are both complex mana sinks that, as you do more to build your deck around them or invest time into making them pop off, but each can do phenomenal things with the space you carve by laying on consistent early pressure. Granite Harbinger is a solid defensive tool against other aggro matchups as a cheap creature that triggers minion and generates card advantage by either finding more copies of itself or finding another solid nightmare like Soulsucker to preserve the board, to pressure the board or your opponent's hand. There's also a slew of solid 2-drops that offer additional damage or card advantage depending on what you're looking to do. Build it as an artifact aggro deck, a hand attack strategy that leverages your opponent's lack of resources to push damage, a burn deck's recurring Void Mist Prodigy while scaling Reinstated Reapers, a devotion deck trying to leverage the strength of Krolkatos and Underworld Tormentor. You can even look at pushing beyond mono black with a splash for multicolor spells that play nice with minion while working with your desired synergies. Minion will help to define the texture of the format because even if nobody brings it to the GP, everyone will have to keep it in mind in case they run up against it. We've got one last monocolor angle to talk about on the aggro side of things. Mono red is another color that can take things fast or slow, and the aggro side of the equation has some profoundly potent pieces to play with. Skilling and Burning Wisdom are probably the two most important pieces for any burn strategy in the format, as both promise to yield consistent and impressive degrees of card flow, especially with so many pieces in the strategy being capable of chipping away at the opponent's life total repeatedly. Laystone of Storms, Crimson Step Sniper, and Orcish Bloodhunter all push damage turn after turn in small increments that add up and play nicely with those card advantage engines, while Renegade Apprentice and Ironcliff Blaster are hard to block attackers that can apply more aggressive pressure right out the gate. After that, it just becomes a puzzle of figuring out your favorite burn spells. Ferocious Flame is a classic staple of the format, though perhaps a little lackluster when so few creatures in the deck can peak up to 4 power. Mirror Blades, being a sorcery, seems sketchy on the surface, but it offers a lot of value when you can lay on pressure from the board by either removing 2 opposing creatures or taking 1 off the board while pushing additional damage to the dome. Punishment from Nyx is another simple shock, but with so many enchantments that damage prevention clause could come up when it matters. Beyond that, Ignite is a solid candidate for if you're looking to build up a lot of permanence or looking to play a more devotion-centric strategy, while High Voltage, Violent Discharge, and Lightning Splinters are all conditional lightning bolts if you can do what they ask of you. Burn will be a force to be reckoned with. It took the crown in the Pauper Eternal GP last April in spite of it being overrun by Diabolical Minion, and a creature-centric red Sly deck was one of the only 4 decks to make the top cut of the first Eternal GP in April of 2023. Have a plan to either outpace or outlast Burn, or you'll find yourself sitting at 2 life before you know it. Speaking of that top cut Sly list, let's get to the multicolor aggro decks and start here. PTM, the deck's core innovator, has a lot of experience with aggro lists in all varieties, and as evidenced by their performance in April 2023, this deck can absolutely perform well. Rather than being all in on burn spells, Skill Link, and Burning Wisdom, PTM's Sly list leans on the best aggressive creatures mana can yield, and looks largely mono-red save for a few non-creature spells. The name of the game here is to make blocking a nightmare for your opponent, so you can punch through with startling efficiency thanks to Emblazoned Hooligan shutting down blockers, Thrice Blessed Boon and Embraced by Dusk giving your creatures menace, Extreme Speed and Horn Rush complicating blocking math, and Raise Rampage providing an avenue to bring your creatures back or rush out a newly developed board. Ferocious Flame ties it all together as being the only key burn spell, taking effective advantage of your auras and pump spells being able to push your creatures above the ferocious line consistently. If you like the appeal of Byrne's card engine but want a more creature-focused plan, Kilgaris was able to secure a spot in the decklist channel this month with a red-white aggro deck built around Piece Together to generate additional cards, and a shelf centered on the best artifact creatures in the format. Every creature in this core triggers Piece Together so long as you make your land drop as the third card type, meaning it's a relatively reliable engine to keep card flow high. Because of this, you can consistently back up your damage output by dropping multiple cards a turn later in the game, especially when additional copies of Piece Together join in on the equation. Electes might sound out of place here as the only permanent that hits the board with meaningful stats and isn't an artifact, but enchantment means that it can still work for Piece Together, and Electes absolutely pushes a lot of damage when left unchecked. White Blue Tempo is one of those old classics that always seems to have a certain remarkable viability about it, and it looks poised to be better than ever thanks to the slew of 2-mana counterspells that come stapled to permanents, meaning flicker effects like Experimental Flight and Uncertainty of Fate can continue to fight for the stack while you apply pressure with your Agents of Deception and Serene Mediators, and your Start News can additionally reuse your Omen of Deceptions. This is another deck that I think is poised to use Heroes Never Die to great effect, thanks in large part to how generally low the curve of the deck is, and just how many things would be nice to bring out at instant speed. You can bend the decks to play more flash synergies and drop the focus on flying creatures, but I do think the aerial strategy is the best plan to pursue, especially thanks to Nitrous Elemental's ability to amplify the amount of damage your cheap creatures can deal turn by turn. This is also another deck I like Granite Harbinger in, as both the white and blue Awoken creatures come with squared stats and flying. The squared stats is relevant to shut down one of the best black removal spells in Fatal Flaw, and the flying just makes them play nicely against low to the ground boards and plays well alongside Nitrous Elemental. I think Awoken Arbiter, the white creature, is better for being more readily castable and providing relevant combat keywords on your turn, but Awoken Thunderer does provide 2 points towards your blue devotion for Agent of Deception while coming in with a larger body and offering the ability to flash back your Heroes Never Die or your Flickers in the late game. Regardless of what your general plan you go for, if you're looking at tempo, then the Omen Agent Mediator shell should treat you well. Heroes Never Die need not be restricted to a tempo plan, of course. Eternal has 3 different 2-mana red enchantments that create 2 creature tokens on enter while sacrificing for additional value. And there's also Sparks of a Revolution coming down on turn 1 and offering the opportunity to start snowballing right out the gate. Tack on to these the fact that there are 2 ways to bump up your token's power for 2 mana, with Ace Trainer leveraging the lack of human typing on your tokens, and Emphatic Beat leveraging your wide board and low curve to threaten multiple triggers each turn, and there's a solid baseline here for a red tokens deck. From there, white can supplement this with removal, flickers, or by pushing up the curve to make room for the love of a lifetime, coupled with a few suitable legendary creatures such as Ardor, Forefront of Freedom. I can't say I'm particularly confident about tokens here, in part because of the lack of truly stellar 1-mana plays for the deck, but I think even if you opt out of the Heroes Never Die angle, there's a lot of interesting things to consider about this kind of strategy. If you want an aggro deck with a bit higher of a curve to it, and one with a lot more play against the combo decks we're about to get into, Hate Bears may be the answer for you. There are a lot of efficient creatures in white and green that can cause your opponent to stumble, but the challenge here is that many could cause you to stumble as well, depending on what you lean on. The cards seen on here are the most immediate candidates for inclusion. Symbol of the Revolution and Veil Touched Soulbinder seem to be the best one-drops in white for pushing damage while being irritating to the opponent, while Ozan Inquirer, Fog Spewer, and Henry and Viridian all disrupt opposing shells, with special honors going to the Inquirer for being able to mess with creatures. Perhaps the best sneaky include here is Winterholm Hairseer, taxing New Divide and Redevelop Cityscape while also interfering with the creature combo decks that otherwise ignore your tax effects like persistent graveyard combos. The biggest issue here is that the best thing to fill out the space in these decks are non-creature spells, like from removal like Event Horizon to value pieces like Revolutionary Class. Hate Bears is a bit of a puzzle to me, but if it's something you're interested in, I know folks have been brewing it, so ask around the Revolution chat. Where there are good graveyard synergies, there are fast decks that can leverage that into wide boards out of nowhere. While I can think of some self-mill decks that might be positioned to take things a bit slower, there's just enough pieces to justify a faster strategy with a variety of different directions you could pursue. There are a handful of solid cheap cards that care about putting things into your graveyard, plenty of different cheap black creatures that can crawl out of your graveyard, and 2 different big beat sticks that can come down for as little as 2 mana if you're okay with eating your graveyard. There's even some options not present on this slide, like Smolderwing decks using high mana value instant and sorceries that can be cast for cheap alternate costs to slip your Hasty Phoenixes out of the bin. Whatever the faster graveyard decks look to do, and even what the slower ones eye up, I think Deep Treader, Arcanist, and Ignited Soul are a key part of any plan that's looking to do this, giving those decks a turn 1 play that meaningfully smooths out your hand while funneling key graveyard pieces out of your hand without giving up board presence. Finally, and perhaps the most gimmicky of the options in the aggro lane, is the Ball Lightning deck. Don't take gimmicky to mean bad, however. This may be a small selection of cards, but they're a phenomenal foundation to build off of. The core of the deck leans on several cheap, hasty creatures that sacrifice themselves in conjunction with the best cheap green creatures that look for the high power creatures to hit the field. Dawnglade Wildbear gets to stand out from the rest of the high power options as it can pick up any Ball Lightnings that are about to sacrifice themselves, including Expendable Arsonist, as the decayed timing plays in your favor. This can also be used to pick up Rogue's Palace Card Shark, one of the two top-end tools that can threaten to drop multiple hasty creatures into play at once. Best of all, Wildbear's ability triggers Revolt, so it can even keep your Blood Frenzied Vanguards on the board for multiple turns. There are options to push outside of red and green if you're looking for some recursion. White and black both have some decent options to add to the equation, like Yeji, Resplendent Idol, and Necrotic Savant, all with their own advantages and drawbacks. If you're looking to splash a color, though, I'd suggest going black for Bloodstitched, Tupilok, and Revenge Tour. Both can provide additional Ball Lightnings once there's one in your graveyard, and better yet, both can be used to get back Card Shark to reuse its enter trigger. Tupilok's also a valid option to hit off of Card Shark and Unveil the Menagerie, while Tor can give that return to Card Shark haste to amp up the pressure. Let's move on to combo, and start with the most creature-focused of these options, and the one that seems to be the biggest on people's radars. Persist combo is a tricky plan to set up in theory, as it requires 3 or 4 pieces depending on what you're doing, but all of those pieces have some degree of consistency and reliability in terms of backups, and a majority are all available to be pulled back by both Heroes Never Die and Raise Rampage, as well as cheated into play with Unite the Clans, Ozon's Blessing, and Axiomatic Shift. There are a number of 3-mana Persist creatures available, but Reawakened Recruit and Ashen Wing Avenger come down for 2 mana to make them the best of the bunch. Similarly, the second half of the combo has a 3-mana option, but you're better off using Opal Caretaker or Rejuvenating Drone due to mana efficiency. Finally, there's Elder of Offerings and Seductive Gorgon. While on the surface it seems like only Gorgon has the ability to kill the moment you have Persist Engine online, Elder of Offerings is capable of it too, provided you have one of either Raise Rampage or Heroes Never Die available in hand with the mana to use them, because Elder can surveil until you've found the Gorgon to convert the damage into the sacrifice into damage. There are a few complex moving parts kicking around here, but the mana efficiency of the individual pieces is very solid, and with cards like Unite the Clans, Ozon's Blessing, and Heroes Never Die all acting at instant speed, there's a lot of ability to threaten to go off on your opponent's turn when needed. From one graveyard-friendly combo to the next, let's talk about the deck I'm most excited about playing with in this field. Methrin Hoarder is a seemingly innocuous 6-mana 3/3 flyer that crystallizes on enter and can eat some permanents to crawl up out of the graveyard. A solid graveyard aggro piece, right? Well, that activated ability being manaless means that you can have it yield 1 or 2 tokens each time you sacrifice it or bring it back, that if you can yield those tokens, there's a kill to be had. The best Part B to add to Hoarder's Part A is Arduous Miners, which can help you discard a Hoarder or other graveyard tool stuck in hand, as well as yield a tapped treasure every time you pull a Hoarder out of your bin. This opens the door for 2 potential combo lines. With a single miner and 2 Hoarders in the bin, you can loop Hoarders by sacrificing one to the other, burning the treasures from the Dragon's Enter trigger and the miner's thing leaving a graveyard trigger. Alternatively, with 1 Hoarder in the bin and 2 miners, any free sacrifice outlet lets you burn the Hoarder repeatedly and eat all 3 treasures yielded from this process to keep dragging it out. The biggest problem here is that these 2 lines have very polarized payoffs for their respective setups. The sack outlets that work with the double miner line fail you with the double Hoarder line, and the best options for the inverse are a tad cost restrictive and can't go off with a single Hoarder. The nice part here is that once again, Raise Rampage and Heroes Never Die are very friendly to the deck's needs, as miners and the payoffs are all eligible targets for either spell. My picks here are to run a split of Elder Offerings and Firearms Dealer. As with Persist, Elder can mill you into the kill with Dealer provided you have Raise or Heroes Never Die up, and there are other artifact synergies like Extraction Ritual that let Dealer chip away more reliably than something like Disciple of Sekinek. That being said, Disciple is a solid card to push for the kill as well, and has better direct synergies with Elder, so it's hard to say which is the best course of action without digging in and trying it for yourself. This is one in particular that has taken a lot of my deck building attention in the early hours of the format, so I may have a clear answer for what payoffs work best in the future. The combo I feel is most friendly to a control shell is Moonlight combo, an old favorite of mine that makes use of a strange rare enchantment and a stranger mythic creature. The basic gist of it is that as long as you can look at the top card of your library freely, any Prophet of the Veils you see on top can be put into your graveyard from from the library to drain your opponent for 2. Because this process gains you life, Moonlight then triggers to let you put Prophet of the Veil back on top, allowing you to look at it again and repeat the cycle. There are 7 cards in the format, actually more than 7, slight typo in my script, that can peek at the top card of your library, and surprisingly, there are arguments for nearly all of them. The important question here is which 2 pieces fit best to be your primary plans to pay off. Elseworld Oracle is easy to find with many creature tutors. Sharesh is a decent creature in its own right if you tried to build more mid-rangey. Korg has some deck building restrictions, but could potentially put Prophet on top for you. Battle Trance is the single cheapest way to enable the combo. Monument to Might can play into artifact and land synergies, and Gaze Upon Civilization can reward you for playing multiple colors of permanence and with potentially the most value of all of these cards. What it ultimately comes down to here is depending on what tutors you're looking to run, which is so important that I think we need to go a bit deeper here. For Moonlight combo, the tutors make a world of difference and play the biggest part in thinning down our choices for what combo enablers you play. No matter the tutors, I think one of them should be Munig's Wisdom. It's a 3-mana sorcery, which can be a little awkward, but it does both of the most important things for putting the puzzle together. It can put Moonlight into your hand, or Prophet on top of your library. Additionally, you should probably be on Battle Trance as one of your 2 enablers. 1 mana is by far your most efficient option to set it up, even if its text is largely irrelevant outside of the combo. And importantly, because it's an enchantment, Wisdom can put that in your hand too. From there, you can choose whether you want to care about Delirium, Approval, or cheap creatures. As mentioned before, Korg is arguably the most tuned enabler for the combo thanks to her ability to set up Prophet or put a Moonlight on top to be cast. But either way, she plays well with what I would go so far as to call the format's best tutor. Thin the Veil requires very little in the way of bending your deck around it as long as there are plenty of viable artifacts and enchantments kicking around the format, and Korg already asks that of you up front. From there, Thin the Veil can cast nearly anything from your deck as long as your graveyard doesn't get cleared, and can even search up Munig's Wisdom to set the Prophet up to kill. If you're worried about graveyard hate, though, Get Your Wish and Gaze Upon Civilization open the door for a variant we haven't had in prior Eternal seasons, playing a Multicolor Matters deck and using cheap multicolor cards like Shrine to Keranos and Ignited Soul to smooth the curve and build up approval for you to get to yield value from both Gaze Upon Civilization and Get Your Wish. If you're worried creatures are going to run you over, though, you could look at a more creature-focused build that searches up Elseworld Oracle with Ozon's Blessing when it's time to kill. The nice thing about both Wish and Blessing is that they're instant, opening the deck up to search a combo piece into play on the opponent's end step so you can untap and go off with more mana at your disposal, or potentially even just go off on your opponent's turn. These play patterns, specifically Wish and Ozon's Blessing, didn't exist last November. Blessing and Wish were both introduced with Cyberos, and Gaze Upon Civilization arrived with Cliques of Nylon. Moonlight may have rotated a long time ago, but honestly, I think it's never looked better. Something of an old mainstay of seasons past, Demon of Darker Paths has seen better days. Formerly, its final cost reduction clause allowed you to sacrifice any number of artifacts and/or creatures, reducing the spell by 2 for each. In conjunction with the old version of Perspicacity, which had no restriction to the cards you could draw, Eggs combos and other Storm-like decks thrived and had a solid showing at the Revolution Worlds Championship of 2023 and its adjacent Eternal GP of April, getting as far as the finals of Worlds 2023 with PTM piloting the in-rotation equivalent. That month's dominance resulted in some heavy hits to the deck, bringing Demon and Perspicacity to the places they are today. But while they've fallen from grace, there are a few new pieces they've picked up to make some space for them. Ley Shard joined the format back in May of this year, giving us 8 copies of a 2-mana treasure that cantrips, while Founding of the 12 joined the format as another way to make tokens as you cast non-creature spells to provide more pieces to pitch to your demons for your spells. The biggest challenge the deck has now is in keeping card flow up, but a recent gain from Cliques of Nylon may finally have the chance to shine in that regard. Ascends to Power is a simple 3-mana enchantment on the surface, letting you draw 2 at the cost of effectively tormenting yourself. In exchange, you can check off one of its policies every turn, all 3 being relatively easy to fulfill at that, and eventually flip it into Omnipotence, a draw engine akin to the official Magic card Necropotence that converts life into cards immediately. Omnipotence becomes even more lethal with an old familiar combo control piece from Demon's standard days, Keening Bell Tower. With Omnipotence in play, Bell Tower mitigates the life cost to draw and pushes damage every time you draw, meaning you win as long as you have more cards in deck than your opponent has life. While there are a lot of complex moving parts to figure out, and this ultimately doesn't solve the card draw issues by itself, this is a huge boon for Demon and makes it seem much more viable to play than it was in November of last year. Eggs isn't the only old reliable official combo deck with an analog in Eternal. There's a Storm deck kicking around a lot with a solid amount of promise and a lot of flexible slots. The core seems to be built around Keranos, Fickle Fortune, Working Together, and Learned Class, all of which can reduce the cost of your key spells. Add in Lunar Vigil, which can eat your draws to bank them alongside generating red mana, and they offer a solid baseline to set up free shards and reduce the cost of Brilliant Mandate and Loving Reunion, two solid wheels that open the door for a lot of draw power, as well as Sermon of the Way to bank a bunch of red mana. All that mana can then be funneled into a Festered Effluvium, which can offer to draw a lot more cards and convert some of that red mana back into black. From there, the version that I'm most familiar with ends on Laboratory Maniac to win on the spot, though there's also Pit of Sharks to push a lot of damage to your opponent and potentially even World Domination to be easily cast off the black mana from Festered Effluvium. One card I'm speculating on here is Back in Action, which is a little tricky to splash but is made easier by the shards, and works nicely with the wheel effects by letting you pitch your enchantments more recklessly to get them back with a single mana from a few cost reducers in play, while drawing multiple cards with Working Together or banking a draw under Lunar Vigil. I especially like this with the Laboratory Maniac plan, as a learned class can get it back with its second level, and returning the Laboratory Maniac with an empty library means you win the game the moment Back in Action resolves. Similarly, if you want to get sneaky with Lab Maniac, there is an option to draw with Ley Shard as well that skips the stack thanks to that draw being stapled to its mana ability. This deck's been a big project for Lilosaur and Silver Parabellum, and they've cooked up something fierce here. The biggest puzzler for me in the combo side of things is figuring out if there's anything with Laboratory Maniac beyond its applications in Storm. There's a way to eradicate your library in World Shift, provided you can empty out your graveyard in advance of Shift resolving, but a 4-mana sorcery with hoops to jump through doesn't make things look easy. Laboratory Maniac has seen use as an A plus B combo in Revolution's history. It's to blame for the format's only currently banned card, On Borrowed Time, which was far easier to assemble the combo with by emptying your library and giving you an extra turn to play around with. Being entirely honest, I could see World Shift being entirely passed over this month, but don't let it fully slip your mind. Folks are cooking some spicy things this month, and I could see someone making it their mission to crack a Lab Shift wide open. Our bridge from combo to mid-range is Reanimator, which can take many shapes. The most combo-centric of these decks, and honestly I think the most solid quote-unquote fair Reanimator deck that plays the bigger reanimation spells, is built around Revenant Benefactor and Bloodwoken Demon, each of which are able to reanimate additional copies of themselves and each other to build a massive board. The best way to get them out of your graveyard and the best way to get them in all want to be non-creature spells to ensure that Benefactor's Enter trigger will always work, which does present a challenge against such a creature-centric format, but does make you less soft to board wipes. Using Unnatural Rebirth or Refuse to Fall to start the chain for 4 mana, you can start to bring back every Revenant and Bloodwoken in your graveyard, and then either let that board sit in play or try to kill instantly with a final piece. Having either Elemental of Surprise or Waker of Slumbering Titans in your graveyard lets you end the chain by getting it back with Revenant Benefactor to give your board a power boost as well as haste, while having a cheap Burning of Payday means in play means you can play a cheap non-creature spell to get the board swinging. Alternatively, if a Seductive Gorgon finds its way onto your board, you can use it to kill your opponent with only 2 of the demons in your graveyard in a single reanimation spell. Just sacrifice whichever demon is in play before its Enter trigger resolves to make sure it's a valid target for the demon it's bringing back. Finally, if you have mana to spare and no haste elemental in your bin, you can try to bring back Bearer of Last Wishes to search your deck for the final piece of the puzzle at the cost of your hand. I feel like the elemental line is the most stable, but I can't deny that there's some appeal to putting Burning of Payday in play early, ending the demon chain on Bearer, and searching up a pair of 0-mana artifacts to give your board +2/+2 in haste. I can't say this deck is amazing, and it gets hit by a lot of the best hate pieces for decks like Persist, but even if you want to just kind of play a fairer reanimation plan, I think Benefactor and Bloodwoken is probably your best bet, since the next best reanimation spells cost 5, and graveyards are already kind of vulnerable in this format. You aren't limited to using your graveyard to cheat, of course. The aforementioned cheap enchantments that make tokens have a use besides aggro, as any copy of Shifting Forms or Distorting Door can be used to flip a token into a massive set of stats. Azimuth the Faded Ruin is probably the single best thing to cheat in if you aren't reanimating, since it applies pressure to your opponent's board as well as being the biggest stat bomb you can find. Orovis the World Carver has potential to put your lingering enchantments to use, letting 5 tap for 10 colorless mana to activate Orovis and cast Azimuth from your sideboard to get both its enter and cast triggers. If you want a third polymorph target, I suppose Vorpal Titan can apply some pressure to the opponent's mana base and can be hit off of a Shifting Forms if you run ways to make artifact tokens. Though it being a less impactful creature than the Eldrazi Titans here is a knock against it. One of the best things Polymorph has going for it is Searing Truth Flame and Studies in Cognitive Motion, as both can take your targets stuck in your hand to the bottom of your library while making these spells cheaper to play. Just a cautionary suggestion, though, be wary of trying to run Ruin lands and other creature lands, as Shifting Forms can inadvertently put a land into play off of them. They do work with Distorting Door, but Ruins also do need you to spend that mana before casting the Distorting Door to be able to be eligible targets, and most creature lands aren't exactly going to be cheap when you're spending 5 mana to polymorph. If cheating things out from your graveyard or library is getting a bit tedious, or you're tired of losing to Solemn Graveyard, you can always resort to cheating things in from your hand. This is the one case where you're happy to always have your big creatures in hand, since Wild Encounter and Whisper of Eltensia can push them out of your hand to the field for a turn for only 5 mana. Though Whisper does require you to have a Revolt active to do so, with Epic Encounter being able to grab a spare copy of Whisper or Azimuth from your sideboard. This makes it a fairly lean package to slip into any deck, mid-rangey or slower. Just be sure to have Ley Shards, Chromatic Shards, and Fetch lands kicking around, so Whisper is easier to reliably get mana out of. Spending 8 mana to cast and activate this is a lot less appealing. Don't think we're done scamming out massive creatures just yet, though. Dragon Feast is much more of a familiar mid-range strategy innovated by NDB and piloted to the first Eternal GP's top cut by Ricky Rister, using Feast of the Crows to police the board while generating value by bringing creatures out of the graveyard. The best of the deck's plans is to be leveraging Feast to passively wipe the board, and then eventually use it to wipe Nesting Hellkite's egg token the moment you put Nesting Hellkite onto the board, which means you can either flip into another Nesting Hellkite to go again, or into a familiar star of the format, Tyrant of Tributes. From there, you get to be a Jund mid-ranger ramp shell that can use Vine Street Stoolie and Ardent Ascetic to build up your mana, as well as a solid mid-range plan with creatures like Fury Call Hellion to fight for the board or push damage across the finish line. This is a deck with a lot of flexibility and is one you'll find some solid options for in the old GP pages found in the description. You don't even have to cheat to jam big creatures. Ramp can take a few different appearances, but most are aiming for Tyrant Attributes as their top end of choice. This first approach comes courtesy of Stasis Bot and uses a heavy basic land ramp package to build up to either Tyrant or alternatively top out at Vorpal Titan to punish greedier mana bases. Dawnglade Cultivator is the big piece that makes a lot of slower green decks tick, and is so good that there are excuses to run it in decks not even primarily built around green, thanks to just how much it helps accelerate your curve. The basic heavy focus also means you have 8 copies of Explorer across the titular ramp spell and its Revelation counterpart, Flourish and Calamity, and getting off-color basics from the best fetches in the format makes Wild Court Seeker a real threat to be reckoned with while padding your mana base. Torch, Till, and Ulfarl Seeking Stensator are at the top end of the ramp suite, with Till being able to bring back fetches as well as bank Torch to start drawing when you flood out, and Ulfarl being able to weaponize those lands in your graveyard to help ramp you while shooting down creatures, or pitch your lands from hand or battlefield to draw you cards and gain life. It's a simple suite, but don't mistake simple for meager. Green Colorless is another ramp deck that uses the Explorer as well, alongside a host of other ways to set up and build lands quickly, on top of utilizing a slew of colorless utility lands to have a safe set of permanents to waste with Landscape Decay and the Source. Once you get enough colorless lands in play, you can jam a bunch of different finishers from your sideboard without needing to be restricted by color, thanks to the Source tapping for any combination of colors for 3 mana. There are also a small selection of single-copy silver bullets in the main deck, like Chasmal Rift being a viable way to search up either a Orovis or a Karn, Heart of Guilt, to the top of the deck. The mana isn't too tricky, and there are a bunch of colorless pieces we've gained from Cybros that have yet to be tinkered with if you really want to get experimental. It's something of a gimmick card on the surface, but there's a genuine conversation to be had here, particularly with respect to Destructive Force. Force is a massive sweeper with a massive complication. But if your mana can be based primarily in artifacts, then you aren't so upset to sacrifice 5 lands when it sets your opponent so far behind. This works best with big red planeswalkers and enchantments, as they can survive the board wipe while causing issues to your opponent turn by turn, and all of them can be increasingly castable off of monuments. The big challenge here is really just finding the time to use them. You could also play powerful mid-range spells by just lying about being mono-red. Kilgaris has had some success trying out a big red deck that opts out of the Monument plan in favor of Dawnglade Cultivator to slip ahead on the curve for a turn 3 4-drop, or a turn 2 Sermon of the Way to enable some of the best 4-mana spells to come down on turn 2. All of this is backed up by the usual best removal suspects in red, as well as Abominable Avalanche to leverage the mana spent on Sermon turns, as well as mana spent in the mid to late game when playing a removal spell and a top-end threat. We also get the treat of a fair Keening Bell Tower, something I suspect will be pretty rare these days with Control having so much pressure on it in this format. As far as what you can ramp up to, if looking at an array of options starts to get too confusing for you, you could always try and simplify matters by gunning for one of the 2 big sorceries we have kicking around. Grand Consonance and Dawnglade Awakening have very similar roles that they fill on the surface. They're 7-mana green spells that want you to play more colors and put permanents from the top 7 cards of your deck into play. The big complication here is what they cheat out. Consonance is at its best with a diverse array of viable hits, and often benefits from these hits being interactive. Ricky Rister has played an in-rotation of Consonance for who knows how many tournaments now, and always has some degree of respectable results thanks to the consistency of the plan and his experience with the card. Dawnglade Awakening is a bigger puzzle. I don't really recall it getting that much play when it was in rotation, but the power here is visible, especially when compared to Consonance. It ultimately becomes a matter of threading a few key needles. What creatures can you justify running for a curve that doesn't fold to aggro without feeling bad off of Awakening? What are the best measures to smooth your mana on the way there? And can you get enough viable creatures to not want the broader field of viable hits off of Consonance? Unfortunately, the biggest problem here is that aggro and combo might demand so many instants and sorceries to interact with on the board that you might just be liable to struggle by leaning on Consonance or Awakening here. If multicolor ramp is up your alley, but you want the flexibility to lean on instants and sorceries, you always have the option to generate Magic's most problematic token. Sustainable investments from Cliques of Nylon has drastically opened the field for potential treasure plans to pursue, which is greatly emboldened by Dazzling Frontiers kicking around at 2 mana. When your best flicker spells can blink these enchantments for extra treasure, while either cantripping or themselves making a treasure, there's a lot to consider. Most importantly, when you're looking at flickering enchantments, you suddenly gain access to a phenomenal suite of black permanents capable of causing headaches for your opponent by picking apart their hand or board, all while building up to a planar Exodus to blink it all again and again and rend your opponent's options to nothing. The biggest dangers here are that the treasures can be somewhat of a vulnerable spot, susceptible to one of the best board wipes in the format, and that this deck has very little game against combo natively. Perhaps that means main decking cards on the fringe here, like Conspiracy of Wealth to eat at graveyards, Athreos to shut down sacrifice loops and neutralize aristocrat damage lines, Dishonor to exile key pieces out from under Persist, and the ever-important Event Horizon to pick off any permanent that's giving you trouble, as well as having some stray creatures that outlast your edict and the -1/-1 counters. The biggest loss here that hurts my heart is the fact that the format is too fast to try casting cute high-cost spells to draw cards off of Dazzling Frontiers, but it's a point of grief treasure decks will have to accept. Fortunately, making a treasure for 2 mana is still plenty fine. If you're really heartbroken though, play one of the 2 mana crystallized creatures in that slot. They're almost all good. Let's say you want a proper 5-color deck, though, one that plays into the board rather than leaning on enchantments. Well, fortunately, Diabolical Minion gets to pretend to be a 5-color card, too. Gilded Reaper opens the door for a jankier angle where you get to play the best multicolor black spells available, potentially getting to push damage with Rose Court Ambitions for each spell you cast, depending on how many colors of mana you spent to cast them. This is mostly a nostalgia recommendation than one that I think is actually great for the field, though. I think it's ultimately a little too slow and reactive to thrive compared to the field's more linear, clean combos and aggro decks. Frankly, this page has no better title than Card Shark nonsense. Rogue's Palace Card Shark is probably one of the most unfair cards in the format, largely held back by the choices places on its pilot at the hands of the opponent, but the opponent has to navigate some pretty tough choices too. Card Shark shines best with value pieces that force your opponent to think carefully about the cards they offer you, and no card causes bigger headaches than Garen Returned Profit. Garen threatens to sacrifice and return your Card Shark, effectively flickering it back in tapped to reuse its enter trigger. Graverot Soothsayer can similarly repeat this at the next end step, meaning you have 8 potential Card Shark hits that can spam it over and over. The biggest problems here are that this repeat line is vulnerable to many of the best anti-persist options, which are likely to be popular as players prepare for a persist-heavy metagame, but Card Shark can still thrive. In fact, a grindy Card Shark mid-range deck completely opting out of Garen and Soothsayer was the first deck to make it into the league deck lists channel in the Hand of Stasis. So don't feel like you're priced into something too gimmicky. Fair stuff can be unfair too. If you're looking to play Red Devotion without having to really build up or lie about being mono red, Military seems like the best bet to keep things smooth. I've got the lower end of the likely curve here, but the top end is pretty similar to the red-green deck topping out on Petros and Koyos. Military is very helpful for building Devotion while making any subsequent creatures far better for preserving momentum, thanks to Military granting them haste and a temporary power buff. The chip damage from its attack clause is also helpful for keeping the opponent on the back foot, as an empty board could suddenly explode into a pair of 3+ power creatures swinging while chipping 2 damage before blockers are even declared. Military is also my favorite place to jam Ignite, which I think has the potential to push a lot of damage without too much strain. Just be aware that your transformed experience creatures don't contribute to Devotion, so while Flame-tailed Lizard does do wonders for Ignite on the front side, it'll stop helping once it flips. You can even push for Green Splash again if you want to try and jam Card Shark to slip all of these cheap creatures and permanents into play, but honestly, I think Military's fine just mono red. If you're interested in a graveyard plan that isn't so reliant on all-in combo, Extraction Mission is probably the best place to be. It's a big Cliques of Nylon card just begging to see experimentation in this broader format. It most recently saw success with Stasis winning last month's GP with it, bringing back some of the best 3-drops in the current rotation. With a broader card pool does come more 3-drops to reanimate with Extraction Mission, but frankly the best options that aren't in rotation don't really hold a candle to what exists in normal Revolution right now. Elemental of Surprise can make future creatures stronger, and powers up Extraction Mission even when it isn't what you're getting back. Conjoined Radiant can funnel your mission creatures to the bin while either getting a counter to enable Ferocious Flame or making a treasure to give you time for more spells, and Rocket Admin could be used to steal your opponent's board state as the 3-mana tax is hard to play around. Unfortunately, that's kind of it. The next best option is probably just Zap Toady using a mission as a pseudo-ritual, since making a token copy with mission makes each Toady yield 2 gold tokens, but that's really janky compared to the alternatives. Being entirely honest, I think you could easily take Stasis's winning list from last month and just tweak the sideboard and removal suite to better suit this format without sacrificing too much in the way of power. Finally, for our mid-rangey decks, if you feel like making your opponent get stuck in a top deck nightmare, we have the Rack. Yes, actual factual Rack is in this format, and it's not alone. Revolution has seen its fair share of viable discard synergy pieces, all tuned to bully your opponent down to nothing so that the Rack and Liturgy of Liliana whittle their life total down to nothing as well. This is a deck I have to fight hard with against my impulses with, because with so many cheap permanents, I feel a familiar, overwhelming urge to slip in a white splash for the instant speed flickers, Event Horizon, Heroes Never Die, and maybe even Planar Exodus. But there's nothing wrong with wanting to just keep it as a mono-black discard deck. And if you're willing to get exploratory, I think this is the best home for Organized Espionage, which is well positioned to set your creatures up to hit harder and lets you convert them into card draw and more discards against your opponent. Alright, we're finally here. Let's talk control and start with the one shell that I think has some chance to cause a lot of problems if someone can figure it out. We have 2 solid 2-mana permanents that can lock out a named spell from being cast, which becomes even more relevant when we have Heroes Never Die being able to either slip these cards into play at instant speed, or just slip something else that's disruptive onto the board. This is a strategy that saw some success while it was all in rotation, and it's positioned well in the face of a few combo decks. Add in the fact that the other great anti-combo cards are all valid hits off of Heroes Never Die as well, such as Winterholm, Hairseer, and Solemn Graveyard, to similarly lock out a lot of those big combo and scam decks. The biggest puzzle really comes down to what shell wants this deck, because honestly, this is more of a control package rather than a proper deck. I feel like it's most well positioned in something like white-blue tempo or green-white hate pairs, but even then, I can't help but wonder if the best combo decks just ignore the bans themselves. Strangely enough, despite mentioning it being the most viable control shell, it says a lot that even this feels kind of meager. While the ban deck has a decent shot of being useful, the control deck I'm most hopeful about seeing success are decks built around approaching greatness. There are 68 enchantments in Eternal that are viable targets for approaching greatness to find, with a lot of the best options found here on screen. There are prison pieces, board wipes, a combo card, and some token generators, all in contention for worthwhile tutor targets for approaching greatness. The best case for approaching is when you want multiples of these high cost enchantments, including pieces beyond just these 8, or even just a high reliance on a single tutor target to maximize your reason to be heavier on copies of approaching greatness. The life gain here is really the key, as it gives you a lot of time against aggro, so from there it just becomes a puzzle of how you play against combo. That wraps up the second part of our look at Revolution Eternal and the assorted archetypes available to try out. It's important to keep in mind that despite all of the options available here, this is merely what I could remember to mention under a bit of a time crunch. There are so many angles to play with thanks to this format sporting over 4,000 cards to consider, so I'd highly recommend doing some research of your own and talking to folks in the Revolution chat for more ideas and inspiration. Next time, we'll wrap up our guide series by covering the key sideboard pieces you'll want to have your eyes on, from popular removal to sideboard tech, and even a discussion of sideboard toolboxes. As mentioned before, if all this talk has you excited for this month's alternate format and you want to give it a try for yourself, head to the description below to join the Custom Magic Discord community to jump into the conversation. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in Revolution chat.